Hey buds, Socialism Done Left here for Commie College, where I educate fellow leftists for saying dumb shit. Today's leftist is Red Plateaus, who produced a video titled What is Democratic Socialism? I actually really like this video. It's pretty thoughtful, it's pretty well produced, and it does a good job of citing stuff and making sure you know what that citation is. Unfortunately, one of those citations is Gilens and Page 2014. They use this citation to argue that the United States should be considered a plutocracy, not a democracy. Let me play the video.
Fortunately for the rich, there's nothing like democracy in the classical sense anywhere in the United States, or, as far as we know, in Europe either. As a recent study by Gilens and Page concludes, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near-zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Who do they find does have power? Essentially, the richest, the ruling capitalist class.
There's nothing inherently wrong with citing Gilens and Page 2014. It's a fine study, they did a good job of summarizing its results. However, 3 more recent studies using similar or related methodologies have found results opposite to those of Gilens and Page 2014. In this video, we'll review 4 studies. First we'll look at Gilens and Page 2014 itself, then we'll look at a pretty direct replication, and then we'll look at 2 studies that use different methodology but examine the same question. Let's start with the study itself, or Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens, authored by Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page in 2014. First, quote, Gilens and a small army of research assistants gathered data on a large, diverse set of policy cases, 1,779 instances between 1981 and 2002 in which a national survey of the general public asked a favor-opposed question about a proposed policy change. Next, they made a list of all organizations that had ever appeared in Fortune magazine's Power 25 list, which is intended to capture the 25 most powerful interest groups in a given year. They also added the lobbying groups for the 10 industries with the largest lobbying budgets. For each of their 1,779 issues, they attempted to determine whether each interest group was supportive or opposed to it. Finally, they manually reviewed, quote, news accounts, government data, congressional quarterly publications, and academic papers, unquote, to determine whether the policy was enacted or not. In short, for 1,779 policy questions, Gilens compiled national survey data, interest group support and opposition, and whether the policy was actually enacted or not. The results were as Red Plateaus described. In Model 4, that's the 4th column, you can see that the preferences of average citizens only had a 0.03 positive correlation with adoption of a given policy, and that this correlation was not significant, meaning that there is insufficient evidence that average citizen preferences are correlated with a policy being adopted, and that even if they are correlated, it's a really weak correlation. In contrast, the preferences of economic elites have a 0.76 correlation with policy adoption and are significant at the p less than 0.001 level. Similarly, the alignment of interest groups has a 0.56 correlation with policy adoption and is also significant at the p less than 0.001 level. This means that there is a strong correlation between economic elites supporting a policy and it being adopted, and interest groups supporting a policy and it being adopted. This is pretty convincing stuff. If Gilens 2014 was the only data available on this topic, then absolutely, you could conclude that the United States is not a democracy, if by democracy you mean one where the median person, in terms of income, has influence on policy. But it isn't. So let's look at oligarchy or class war, political parties and interest groups, and unequal public participation on policy adoption, by Matt Grossman and William Isaac. This study is a pretty direct replication of Gilens 2014, with additional data considered. First, for each policy, they examined whether Republican and Democratic leadership were in support or opposed to this policy, rather than just examine policy adoption on its own. Second, they expanded the number of interest groups by including a lot more mass advocacy groups which were missed by the original dataset. Third, each policy proposal was coded as economic, social, or foreign policy. Fourth, each policy was coded as liberal, conservative, or mixed, and as large, medium, or small in terms of policy shift. And so, if Gilens' results were really strong, we'd expect to find basically the same results as in that study. We do not. It turns out that breaking down by party support or opposition, and that breaking down by policy area is really important to determining the impact of elites on policy. First, let's look at figure 1. Here you can see that there's a strong positive correlation between affluent opinion, meaning people at the 90th percentile, and Republican position. There's no correlation between affluent opinion and Democratic position. There's a strong negative correlation between the middle class opinion and the Republican position. For the Democrats, the more likely the middle class are to support something, the more likely the Democrats are to support it. This seems like strong evidence against the plutocracy position. If it were true that the middle class had no political power, then it wouldn't make sense for the Democratic Party to adopt their positions. And by adopting their positions, the Democratic Party is of course giving those positions power. So it seems like the average American does have a significant impact on the Democratic Party at least, if not the Republican Party. Now let's look at Table 6, which looks at policy adoption by each of the 3 types of policy: foreign, economic, and social. Middle class preferences were significantly positively correlated with economic policy, while affluent preferences were only significantly positively correlated with foreign policy and not with economic or social policy. Business preferences were positively correlated with foreign policy and social policy, but not with economic policy. advocacy preferences weren't positively correlated with anything. Weirdly enough, the only two groups which have a significant impact on economic policy are the middle class and Republican leadership, not the economic elite, not the business preferences, not the advocacy groups. This is a strong refutation of Gilens' study. And we're going to review two more studies that have findings in a similar vein. The third study of today will be testing models of unequal representation, Democratic populists and Republican oligarchs by Rhodes and Schaffner 2017. Rhodes and Schaffner use a different method to estimate how responsive our representatives are to our opinions. First, they take a subsample of the Catalyst dataset, which is used by the Democratic Party for electioneering purposes. The Democratic Party uses it because it provides pretty detailed information on where people live and what they believe. Rhodes and Schaffner use this to estimate individual income and individual ideology. Next, they aggregate this to the district level, and then they compare these measures with the DW Nominate score, which is used to measure how liberal or conservative a given member of Congress is. The y-axis here, the regression coefficient, indicates how closely the ideology of a congressperson reflects the ideology of their constituents. Higher means more representative. In fact, this study found that higher income was associated with lower representativeness. You can see that in the graph on the left. The correlation between a representative's opinion and their constituent's opinion is 0.7 at the 0th percentile of income, and it decreases as income increases up to about the 85th percentile of income, where the correlation between a representative's views and a constituent's views is only 0.45 or so. However, in the graph on the right, you can see that this is mostly driven by the Democratic Party. In the Democratic Party, we see the same pattern as before. Representativeness decreases as income increases, while in the Republican Party, we find exactly the opposite. As income increases, so too does representativeness. In short, Democrats really do represent the poor more than the rich, and Republicans really do represent the rich more than the poor. I will note that this study is weaker than the other studies because it doesn't look at opinions about individual laws or votes on individual laws. Instead, it looks at where on the ideological spectrum a respondent is, a constituent is, and then compares it with where on the ideological spectrum their representative is. So it's not about individual laws, it's not about whether the respondent is voting for their opinions on individual laws, but rather about averages of opinions. And finally, the fourth study of today, The Party or the Purse, Unequal Representation in the US Senate by Lax, Phillips, and Ziesler, 2019. This study, like Gilens, begins by collecting a list of national polls conducted by the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, the National Annenberg Election Survey, Gallup, and Pew. Next, they separate people into three kinds of groups. First, by partisan group, Democrats, Republicans, or Independents. Then into economic group, rich in the top quintile or top 20%, poor in the bottom quintile or bottom 20%, or middle in the middle 20%. And then into state group, just aggregating by state. Next, they look at the 49 questions which specifically asked respondents how they would vote if they were a member of Congress. And finally, they looked at the way in which the senators from that state voted on that bill. This one's probably the simplest of the bunch. I thought this graph was particularly interesting because it supports the results of the last study. This study finds that about 80% of the time, Republicans vote with the rich, and almost never do they vote entirely with the poor. In contrast, Democrats vote about 60% of the time with the poor, and about 40% of the time with the rich. In short, the Democrats aren't a workers' party, but they do lean heavily towards the poor. And while the Republicans aren't an oligarchs' party, they do lean very, very heavily towards the rich. Figure 16 has even more detailed results. First, in the section Battles of the Purse, we find that the Democrats will always prefer the poorer entity to the richer entity. They favor the poor over the rich, the middle class over the rich, the poor over the middle class, and statewide averages over the rich. And every time, Republicans do the opposite. But this is flipped when we only look at people inside the party. The Democrats will favor rich partisans over poor partisans, rich partisans over middle class partisans, and middle class partisans over poor partisans. In short, rich and middle class Democrats do have more power within the Democratic Party, even if those partisans favor policies that benefit the poor. Another very interesting result is when the views of the partisans and the views of the rich disagree. When the rich or the middle class disagree with the views of their partisans, the Republicans and the Democrats will always choose the partisans over the rich or the middle class. It really is party over the purse, even if the purse motivates the party. To summarize, the original Gilens and Page study found that there was no significant correlation between the views of the middle class, people at the 50th income percentile, and whether a policy was adopted or not. 3 follow-up studies have been conducted, each of which finds results directly contradictory to those of the Gilens study. First, a pretty direct replication of the Gilens study found that the middle class's preferences are in fact the only significant predictor of economic policy, and that while the affluent do have a significant power over foreign policy, they do not have significant power over economic policy. A study using district-level data found that the ideology of a district's respondents strongly correlates with the ideology of a district's representative. And what's more, if you're poor, you're even more likely to have your views represented by your representative than if you're rich. And finally, a third study, which correlated views of respondents in a given state on a given bill with the ways that their senators actually voted, found that the Democratic Party generally votes with the poor, while the Republican Party generally votes for the rich. All of this evidence suggests that the United States might be a flawed democracy, but it certainly is not a plutocracy. And that's all I've got. If you like the video, like and subscribe. If you really like the video, give me money on Patreon, and I'll say thanks to you, like I'm saying thanks to these patrons right now, Shane, Kira, and Ratpack. Have a nice day.